The 1960s saw a lot of cognitive revolutions. One of these revolutions, which I already hinted at, was the hierarchical reversal between the written word and the action. Traditionally, in Western culture, writing had superiority over action, and writers were considered superior to performers. The main reasons for it were that the written word was regarded as more universal than the private action, and more importantly, more durable. But towards the 20th century, humanity invented recording technologies that enable us to preserve actions as well, and the middle of the century already saw the rise of people who felt that the subordination to the written word is oppressing the human spirit. We've already met Jack Kerouac, who felt that his art of writing was inferior to the art of jazz musicians, and wanted to write the way they played. We've also met Allen Ginsberg, whose poetry truly came to life only when he read it out loud. Here's Kerouac doing something similar, reading excerpts from On the Road.
I was traveling west one time, at the junction of the state line of Colorado, its arid western one, and the state line of poor Utah. I saw in the clouds, huge and massed above the fiery golden desert of evenfall, the great image of God with forefinger pointed straight at me, through halos and rolls and gold folds that were like the existence of the gleaming spear in his right hand, which saith, "Come on, boy, go thou across the ground. Go moan for man. Go moan. Go groan. Go groan alone. Go roll your bones alone. Go thou and be little beneath my sight. Go thou and be minute as seed in the pod. Go thou, die hence. And of this world report you well and truly." So, in America, when the sun goes down, and I sit on the old broken down river pier watching the long, long skies over New Jersey, and sense all that raw land that rolls in one unbelievable huge bulge over to the west coast, and all that road going, and all the people dreaming in the immensity of it. In an hour, I know by now that children must be crying in the land where they let the children cry. And tonight the stars will be out, and don't you know that God is Pooh Bear? The evening star must be drooping and shedding her sparkler dims on the prairie, which is just before the coming of complete night that blesses the earth, darkens all the rivers, cups the peaks, and folds the final shore in. Nobody knows what's going to happen to anybody besides the forlorn rags of growing old. Think of Dean Moriarty, I even think of old Dean Moriarty, the father we never found. Think of Dean Moriarty, I think of Dean Moriarty.
Dean Moriarty, the central figure of the novel, is actually Neal Cassady, and the book tries to capture the unique essence of his personality. What Cassady Moriarty chases throughout the story is what he calls it. He cannot explain what he means by it, but he finds it at some moments, usually in jazz performances. It, as I understand it, is the feeling that you are at the center of your existence, flowing along with it, rather than being behind it due to the time it takes your consciousness to perceive it. But you are not just passively flowing along, but being an active force that affects the direction of the flow. Then you become it, become the thing itself. The novel portrays Cassady as a spontaneous and energetic man, a man who flows from within, a man who is closer than anyone to the ideal of it. This was the ideal that the beatniks aspired to live by, and through it they distinguished themselves from others. The person who was rigid in his thinking, enslaved to patterns that deny him the ability to experience the flux of existence, was what they called square, whereas the person whose mind is tuned in to the right wavelength was called hip. The beatnik's goal, then, was to be free of any mental rigidness, and develop an elastic and flowing consciousness. Beat consciousness is not something you can read and learn, but only grasp intuitively, get on the same wavelength. The Merry Pranksters adopted this attitude, and defined it as being in the movie, part of the plot of existence, not an outside viewer. They too regarded Neal Cassady as the ideal man, seeing him as someone who is always in the movie, but they also took the philosophy of beat further and created an entire worldview around it. The way they saw it, the universe is synchronized and happiness is being part of this synchronicity, but our consciousness detaches us from it and therefore we are not synchronized with the universe, and feel misery as a result. And so, whoever manages to overcome the mental timeline and experience it, experiences the biggest joy of them all. In music, as mentioned, the revolution occurred sooner. Traditionally, Western music was also subordinate to the written sign, so much so that the title musician was taken away from the performers, those who actually play the music, and given to the composers, those who write it on paper. In the 19th century, the cultural heroes were composers such as Beethoven, Schumann and Wagner, whereas the performers were less important. But once the recording technologies reached a point where you could get pleasure while listening to a musical recording, the tables began to turn. The emphasis was shifted back to the musicians themselves, those who actually play the music. From that point, most youngsters preferred to listen to pop music, which puts the emphasis on the performance and the recording, above classical music, which puts the emphasis on the note sheet. Nevertheless, the American pop industry, known colloquially as Tin Pan Alley, was still bound to old concepts, and maintained a clear distinction between the different crafts. The lyricists would write the lyrics, the composers would set them to music, and the performers would perform the songs. Usually, the lyricist and composer were teamed up to create a songwriting duo. But the real heroes of pop music in the first half of the 20th century were the jazz musicians, who regarded Tin Pan Alley songs merely as a starting point, on which you should improvise and create music. In jazz, the creative act takes place when the music is played, not when it's written. This is the ideal that the beatniks tried to bring into literature and poetry, and to create the perfect art form, they wanted to combine it with jazz music. Unfortunately, by the 1950s, jazz drifted away so much from the world of the pop songs that it was almost impossible to attach lyrics to it. The attempts to marry Ginsberg-style poetry with jazz music were not very successful. The salvation came from rock and roll, but it took time until that happened. At first, rock and roll was unruly teen music, which shattered some of Tin Pan Alley's conventions. But once the pop industry got over the initial shock, it managed to put a leash on rock and roll, and in the beginning of the 60s it became pretty sophisticated music. Again, it was songwriting teams who wrote songs about the world of the adolescents, with some clever musical arrangements. This held on until the Beatles conquered America in 1964, and after that, Tin Pan Alley never went back to the way it was. The Beatles signed their songs Lennon-McCartney, going by the old convention of lyricist and composer duo, but in reality there was no such work division. Both Lennon and McCartney wrote both lyrics and music. They created their songs spontaneously while playing together, and the result were songs that were tailor-made for the band, and they had the talent to make them no less sophisticated than those of the professional songwriters. The Beatles turned the pop band into an autonomous unit that isn't dependent on anyone to create its art, and everyone who came after them internalized this change. Under their influence, Bob Dylan also formed the band, and managed to combine poetry with music. The electric guitars and keyboards, which were developing fast in those years, allowed the musicians to sustain a chord and bend it in every direction, and thus match it to the singing in a way that jazz blowers couldn't. And they had another advantage: the ability to create buzzing, distorted sounds that feel like acid eating at your brain, sounds that were previously unheard in music and had an enormous novel effect. These sounds, along with the elasticity of rock, and freestyle improvised playing in the style of bebop jazz, formed the basis of what became known as acid rock, and the first to concoct it were the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead belonged to the next generation of rock and roll, the more sophisticated generation that came in the wake of the Beatles. The members of the band came from folk, jazz and classical music, genres that considered themselves superior to rock and roll, but the combined attack of the Beatles, the Stones and Dylan made them realize that rock and roll is a true purveyor of the spirit of the time. The band formed in San Francisco in 1965, and developed a style that started out from a familiar tune of rock and roll, blues or folk, but then broke in freestyle improvisations, extending the piece into a long jam. As part of the San Francisco scene, they soon became acquainted with LSD and realized it made them feel synchronized with each other, as if one mind was controlling all of them. The merry pranksters took notice, and felt that these youngsters are on the same wavelength as they are, so they invited them to be the house band in their acid tests. It didn't take long until the pranksters began to consider the Grateful Dead as the engine driving the bus, the band that creates the music that expresses it. In a Grateful Dead performance, the ideal was achieved. The participants felt that they are losing themselves, swallowed by the music, and the music would take them on trips to unexpected places, because it was completely improvised. An ideal Grateful Dead concert had the band mingle with the crowd, with everyone flying high on psychedelics and everyone constituting one tribe dancing together, each doing their own thing but also being part of the whole. But it's hard to find film documentation of these concerts, because the Dead were afraid that exposure will commercialize them and detach them from this happy existence. This is footage from 1967, filmed without their knowledge. It's a more standard performance, on stage, but it does give some idea of their style. We can witness the advantage rock has over jazz when it comes to manifesting the psychedelic ideal. When the band begins to sing, the members stop improvising on the instruments and start playing background chords, but the electricity allows them to maintain the power and acidic sound, creating a sense of continuity between the singing parts and the instrumental parts, continuity that bebop found it hard to create. Thus, through acid rock, the ideal of merging beatnik poetry and bebop improvisations could be achieved. So the Pranksters and the Grateful Dead largely managed to live up to the ideal of beat, but for that they had to make some fundamental changes to some of the ingredients of beatnik culture. Rock instead of jazz, acid instead of cannabis, wild dancing instead of meditative thought. Of course, this did not escape the eyes of the beatniks, and while some of them joined the revolution, many others didn't like the new direction. In the beginning of the 60s, when the North Beach scene became too commercialized for their taste, many of the beatniks moved to Haight-Ashbury, a picturesque San Francisco neighborhood. But there, too, they found many youngsters who wanted to imitate them and become part of their world. Annoyed by these upstarts, they started to derisively refer to them as hippies, meaning individuals who desperately want to be hip, but don't really know how. But it was these youngsters who had the last laugh, because they formed the social crowd that adopted the new gospel of the Pranksters and the Dead, and turned Haight-Ashbury into the new cultural center. In September 1965, a local newspaper published an article on the new beatnik scene, and used the word hippies to distinguish its members. The moniker stuck. Another thing that the beatniks bequeathed to the hippies was the attempt to add the light show to the multimedia art they envisioned, so there will be a visual element to complement the poetry and music. Here, too, the beatniks didn't succeed, but a decade later there was better technology, which also blended in naturally with the electricity of acid rock and allowed the hippies to materialize the vision. The merry pranksters used a stroboscope to project a plethora of lights and create a kaleidoscopic effect, and the San Francisco dance clubs adopted this technique, and invented others, to create an overall experience. Today it looks primitive, but back then it was new and exhilarating. This is a film auditorium, one of the main hippie hangouts. Check out the amazingly advanced technology used to create the light show. The band we see here is Jefferson Airplane, one of the local bands that adopted the Grateful Dead style. Jefferson Airplane would also play log improvised pieces, but the real power was actually in writing 3-minute pop songs, something the Dead were never good at, and they also figured out how to squeeze acid rock into the 3-minute format to produce hits. They also had a good female singer, Grace Slick, that had not only sex appeal but also a powerful voice that could transfer the power of acid rock. Jefferson Airplane was the first band on the scene that got a record contract, in the middle of 1966, and they led the style out of the underground in 67, with some major hits. In this record they take surreal images out of Alice in Wonderland and turn them into a psychedelic trip.
And the ones that mother gives you don't do anything at all. Go ask Alice when she's 10 feet tall.
And yet, Grace Slick was not the most powerful female voice on the scene. There was someone who surpassed her. Big Brother and the Holding Company was a band that played acid rock that veered towards the blues, but the real asset was their lead singer. Janis Joplin was white, but she appropriated and intensified the ecstatic style of black soul singers. Joplin, a free-spirited and pleasure-seeking chick, soon became the most recognizable hippie, the one who symbolized the culture in the eyes of the world. Another prominent band on the scene, which solidified in the early months of 1966, was Country Joe and the Fish, a band that came from leftist folk but was taken over by psychedelia. Country Joe wrote satirical and amusing songs on political and social issues, and combined his leftist approach with the hippie message. Here are some other bands on the San Francisco scene, which played acid rock and nourished the fledgling hippie culture. By late '66, the style began to have an effect outside of San Francisco. In Los Angeles, the band Love started out playing nasty garage rock, but then changed direction towards soulful ballads with acid inflections. Another important band from LA was Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, a band that combined the worlds of rock, doo-wop, jazz and classical music, and threw it all into a psychedelic cauldron to produce music that made fun of all of these worlds. The music was satirical, freestyle, unbound by any rules, to the point of cacophony. Zappa and his gang did not belong to the hippie subculture, but they took a lot from it, even as they were ridiculing it. In Austin, Texas, the 13th floor elevators were busy developing their own sound. It was basically a jug band, a country style known for its wild mirth, but the elevators electrified the jug to intensify the merriment and turn it into raucous garage rock. This is their first single from 1966, and after that they combined their sound with acid rock. In New York, a bunch of smart-ass beatniks formed the Thugs, a band that tried to bring the beatnik spirit into 60s music, and created anarchic and sarcastic rock.
Tell me why!
Finally, We should mention another band that operated in New York in 1966 and combined freeform rock music with a dazzling light show, just like the Hippies. But the Velvet Underground were in no way a psychedelic band. Actually, they were the antithesis of what came out of San Francisco. Different philosophy, different drugs, different attitude. They despised the hippies and were rejected by them. But they, too, played an important part in the revolution that overtook rock and roll music in 1966. As we can see, acid rock took on slightly different forms in every city. That's because, unlike today, young musicians had no ability to see or hear what their peers were doing in other places in the world at that moment, and had to rely on hearsay from those who traveled between the cities. And so, the attempts to imitate San Francisco produced various and original offshoots. This was especially true for London, where psychedelic underground also started to develop in 1966, revolving mainly around the UFO Club. There were several bands on the scene, among them the band we are hearing now, Soft Machine, which took its name from a book written by the godfather of beat, William Burroughs. But the biggest British acid rock band was, without a doubt, Pink Floyd is the best example for the advantages of slow communication. Its members heard wonders about what was going on in San Francisco, wanted to match the Americans, and ended up creating something more advanced. While the San Francisco bands were dependent on the lighting provided by the clubs they played in, the Pink Floyd hired a team to help them create their own unique light show, and gave every song its own treatment. They also experimented with sound systems, and scattered loudspeakers all over the venue to create a feeling that the music is coming from every direction and flooding the listener. Musically, the Haight-Ashbury bands improvised within regular blues scales, while the Floyd blended Eastern scales into their music, displayed influences of avant-garde composers like Stockhausen, and were not shy of including sounds that were considered non-musical. The Pink Floyd brought the model of the autonomous band to new heights.
The Pink Floyd. You're going to hear them in a minute, and I don't want to prejudice you. Hear them and see them first, and we'll talk about them afterwards. But 4 quick points I want to make before you hear them. The first is that what you heard at the beginning, that short bit, those few seconds, are really all I can hear in them, which is to say, to my mind, there is continuous repetition, and proportionately they are a bit boring. My second point is that they are terribly loud. You couldn't quite hear that because, of course, from your sets, it isn't as loud as it is here in the studio and as it was in the festival hall in the Queen Elizabeth Hall on Friday. I will ask them about that when we come to talk. My third point is that perhaps I'm a little bit too much of a musician to fully appreciate them. And the reason why I say this is that, they have an audience, and people who have an audience ought to be heard. Perhaps it's my fault that I don't appreciate them.
We see how much this music was unfathomable to those who grew on classical music, and were therefore bound to the form of the music instead of trying to open up to the experience. On the one hand, the musicologist is open-minded enough to admit that maybe the problem is with him, but even with this open-mindedness, he still displays a snobbish attitude and believes that he is the musician, as if his musical logic is the real one, and there could be no other. But the kids who grew up on rock and roll were ready to understand music that was driven by its own rules, not enslaved to the logic of written music. Despite his misgivings, the music of the Pink Floyd emerged triumphant, and it still sounds fresh and exciting, even 50 years later. Most clips we see here are from 1967, and that is because in 1966, the exciting year in which acid rock took form, it was still underground and was not filmed. The 1966 clips we saw, like the 13th floor elevators, sound more like mid-60s rock and roll, with touches of acid. This is the most that the general public was able to take that year, but all of that was about to change. Towards the end of 1966, Ken Kesey came back from his exile in Mexico, and, true to the prankster credo, began popping up in different places in San Francisco, including appearing on TV and daring the police to catch him. Eventually he got caught, was brought before a judge, and released on probation due to his declaration that he came back to tell the youngsters to stop taking drugs. The authorities were hoping that he was going to talk about how dangerous the drugs are, but Kesey had different reasons to abandon LSD. The way he saw it, the drugs were just a way to achieve a higher level of consciousness, and now that we've achieved it, it is time to move on and look for the thing that will take us to the next level. Therefore, he summoned the Merry Pranksters and the Grateful Dead for one last acid test, named the Acid Graduation Test, which will be based only on music, no drugs, and will mark the transition to the next phase. Kesey didn't know what the next phase will be, but believed it will emerge during the test. But the graduation ended in failure. No new idea was born out of the event, and the only thing it marked was the demise of the Merry Pranksters. But the seed the pranksters have sown has already sprouted, and was beginning to grow and spawn. Acid rock was now the center of San Francisco's bohemian life, the thing around which everything else revolved. The psychedelic scene was now trickling into the consciousness of the people living outside of the Golden City, and what was more important, acid was beginning to trickle into the music of the leading pop bands, and from early 1967 it was going to wash over the pop world and change it beyond recognition. Summer was coming, and it was going to be a very special summer.